What happens when your worst fear becomes your reality? Hi, I'm Brent Cassidy. Welcome to the Nightmare Success In and Out podcast, where we explore how to overcome your fears and nightmares and set yourself free. We're going to be exploring this topic with guys I was in Leavenworth with and others who survived their own nightmare. These stories can be inspiring, sometimes sad. There's some humor, but hopefully you can come away with a nugget of something that'll help you knock down some of the prisons you built up in your own mind. All right, Nightmare Success In and Out listeners, we're back, and man, am I excited for the guest that I have today with Carlos Rebollo. Just to give you a piece of what this guy is about. At the age of 15, he was sentenced to 45 years in the state of Connecticut prison. He served 24 years of that prison sentence. I didn't even know that you could go to prison when you're 15 years old and be put in an adult population. That's news to me, and I've been to prison. During his incarceration, he earned an associate's degree in psychology, became a student of Yale University and the University of New Haven. HBO has contacted him, and they're doing a documentary on his life because it's so fascinating. He's now out, released. He's been out for 3 months, and he's a full-time student at the University of New Haven. He's pursuing a bachelor's degree in the multi-platform journalism. And I've got to tell you, I've read a lot about Carlos, and it's such a cool story how when he was in, he just made a change with these mentors that he got with. And man, everything that he did after that, I can't wait to jump into how someone can change their mindset, change the way that they view their life, and how they move forward in that. He started reaching out, making phone calls and writing letters and getting connected way before he ever got out of prison to get a head start in his life. He's now sharing his story to help others, and Carlos is a real inspiration. Before we get into this, and we're going to get into all of this, I want to introduce our new sponsor to the program, Auto Plaza Direct. You know, who likes spending a couple of weekends walking the car lots looking for a car? Then you spend, 4 to 5 hours at the dealership to buy a car. It's kind of like a trip to the dentist. Well, there's a better way to take away all this pain and hassle of getting a car. It's called Auto Plaza Direct. They are your personal car concierge. Just let them know the car you want, what you can pay, and they'll go find that car for you. Negotiate your best price and deliver that car to you in any state. They also offer you warranties and financing, full service. Go to autoplazadirect.com to get started with your personal car concierge. The new hassle-free way, the car buying experience you deserve. Autoplazadirect.com. Tell them Brent from Nightmare Success sent you. All right, folks, let's jump into this. Carlos Rebollo, welcome, my man. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for inviting me, Brent. It's an honor. I'm glad to continue spreading the message and enlightening people on my story so that they can be aware that success is possible with responsibility. We have to give a shout out to Travis Ritchie, too, for connecting.
That's right. Travis, and Travis the other day said, hey, I need to connect you to Carlos. And Travis has an incredible story. For those, he was a Nightmare Success on like 6 or 7 podcasts ago. Go check that one out, Travis Ritchie. But he connected me to Carlos and said he's got a great story. He needs to get on Nightmare Success. It's a Nightmare Success story. So Carlos, man, thanks for being here. We did a little redo. This is our second time around because Carlos was breaking up on his internet, and he had such a powerful answer to the beginning of this thing that I said, we got to stop. We got to start over. So this is our second time around. So Carlos, first of all, man, you made it. You're out, and what a way that you got out. And like I said, I really didn't understand until I started reading about your story that you could go into prison at 15 years old, be with adults, and serve. I mean, you basically served more time than you had been alive in prison, which is, fascinating. And I know you're working on a lot of things right now on why that needs to change and legislation on why somebody at that age they're not supposed to be in that environment. But I want to go back, Carlos, because you were 15 when this happened to you, but what was going on before this? How did Carlos end up at 15 years old going into a prison with adults? What was life like for you growing up as a kid?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and it's a great place to start. As a child, my situation wasn't unique. It reflected the reality of every single child in the world. I was naturally curious. I wanted to understand the world around me, and I was dependent on people to provide me with the kind of guidance that would help me develop into a healthy human being. Unfortunately, my mother was abusive, and my father was a drug addicted, violent man. And I grew up around senselessness and chaos, and it made me feel inadequate as a person. I mean, I didn't know what it was expected of me. I didn't know what would get me beat, what would get me yelled at, what would get me ridiculed or punished. But something very interesting happened that struck me deeply. And that was when I was sent to school and I started to learn how to read. And I felt like there was something about the world that was within my control. And I started to read everything that I could get my hands on, anything that my eyes would come across. I would just read it and say to myself, my God, like I can understand something. The problem was when I would go back to my home environment, I would get presented with the opposite sense of self. And so the feelings of inadequacy would happen again. And early on, there was this tension that was building up within me. And I had to find a way to deal with that tension. And eventually, I found myself in a position where I started asking, not specifically, but as a child, these thoughts run in many different manners. And you get kind of a sense of the impression that you're hinting on rather than the specificity of what's going on at the moment. And so in my mind, what was going on was the question that could the child that I love, the studious, curious, optimistic child that goes to school, continue to survive in the environment that I was being exposed to at home? And eventually I decided that he couldn't, Brent, at all. And, I remember thinking to myself along the lines of, if this is what the world wants for me, and by the world I meant the little space that I was in, but since as a child you can't isolate that kind of experience, I generalized it to the entire world. And I said, if this is what it is for me, meaning the violence, the senselessness, the chaos, then this is what I'm going to give them. And I'm going to give it to them in a way that is better than the way they're giving it to me. And that set me up for a lot of failure in life early on.
So you were, and I meant to ask you, did you have any siblings, brothers, sisters in this environment?
Yes, it was a 4-bedroom apartment with 8 siblings and 2 parents.
Wow. Where'd you fall into that order of kids?
I was the second oldest.
Okay. So if I remember reading about your background, you kind of fell out of school like around 5th grade, right?
The last grade I completed before being incarcerated, yes, was the 5th grade.
So what does a 5th grader out of school do?
I would start answering that question by saying that early on I started developing values that were very criminal in their nature. And so I started paying attention to the things and further and further into the streets, into criminal thinking, criminal activity. And the interesting thing about that is I want to tell a story that has to do with a bit of racism because it has a lot to do with my crime. And so my first introduction into racism was when I was coming back from school with my cousin, and there were young African-American children in the playground. And he said to me, we have to take the long way home. We can't take the shortcut today because they're over there. I said, well, what's wrong with them? He said, we just can't go through there. So I told him, well, you can go wherever you want, but I'm taking the short way home. And he was like, okay, go ahead. So the closer I got to these young children, the more they started approaching me. And so I thought that there was something off, but it didn't quite click in my mind. So I continued to approach. And suddenly we both stopped, and I knew what was going to happen. So they started to chase me, and I started to run. Now, every time I would encounter them, there was this idea in the neighborhood that Puerto Ricans don't like blacks and blacks don't like Puerto Ricans. I never bought into it. I never could understand it. I just knew that I had to fight whenever I would encounter young African Americans because I know that they were going to try to hurt me. So when I started to sell drugs and adopt into the culture and buy into the ideas that were prevalent around that, because I wanted to fit in, gave into this notion that white people were the problem. Mm-hmm. And so I've never had any problems with white people in general. My violence came from interacting with Hispanics and African Americans. But interestingly enough, because I wanted to fit in, now all of a sudden the idea that white people were the problem became interesting to me. And because I was an emotional mess and I had gave up on my mind and thinking, and the only thing that was left up for me were my emotions. Mm-hmm. And so I adopted this idea that, yes, in order to fit in, get with the homeboys, hang out, be cool, then I couldn't like what they didn't like. And this allowed us all to click in a way that even though it was unhealthy and it wasn't good for us, it kept us together in a very negative and counterproductive way. And so now I not only projected that the world was completely a mess, but now that white people were also to blame for that mess, rather than my parents, rather than the values I adopted, rather than the criminal lifestyle I was leading. And I just started to hone in and isolate on these things that made me dehumanize other people in a way that led me to commit the crime that I committed. And we could lead right into that now because I think it's important to mention is that I assaulted an elderly white woman because I knew that she had guns in the house. And so all I focused on was breaking into the house and getting the guns no matter who was in there. What is disgusting about it, Brent, is that I know to this day in my heart of hearts that if it was a black woman or Hispanic woman in there, I wouldn't have did what I did at all. And this is the problem that people don't understand when they preach these racist things to their children when they're growing up. Mm-hmm. They don't understand that as children, we make distinctions or, gradations when something is told to us. We take it in its totality and interpret it however we want. So when somebody tells me white people are the problem, they don't have to tell me why. They just have to point to a person and their color, and it's all red from there. Yeah. And, that's sad to say, but it's the truth. And I want to make it clear that these things that are being spoken about racism, even as a child, when they're trying to blame white America as a whole, my example is one of the consequences that children enact when they don't have that kind of guidance and they're preached at an early age.
Well, and I think any of those things that happen, Carlos, or what you're talking about at that age are so impressionable. And, from who you are with, the places you are, the environment that you're, like you said, your small world of how you perceive things, that's how you were growing up in it. And, it's you can be dangerous with words. There's no doubt about it. And clearly, labeling people on different sides can end up to be, a dangerous environment. It reminds me of Darrell Woods that was on this program, and he was wrongly convicted of murder, but he made real change when he was in prison. But when he got out, he created this Better Together program where police officers and gang members got together to break bread, basically to have a barbecue, but neither one of them knew that they were gang members or police officers. They just were there to shoot horse, play a little basketball, cornhole, whatever, and then they would then eat and kind of be in a circle, and they then were introduced to the fact that they were on opposite sides. But they realized that they had a whole lot more in common, not knowing who each other were, than automatically assuming that they're bad on both sides. And it really reminds me of that, Carlos, of what you're talking about. If you see somebody a certain way, instead of really understanding, what's their background, what's their story, how did they get here, without knowing any of that and just assuming something, it causes, it's just such a bad shortcut. So going back into what you're saying, Carlos, you committed this crime at a very young age. it's a bad one. Were you immediately investigated, arrested? How did you get into the hands of the law enforcement?
So I ran out of the house and I had, blood on me. And so when I saw my younger brother, I decided to switch clothes with him. And I told him, my 13-year-old brother, to burn the clothes. And the next day, I got arrested because I had assaulted a teacher prior to that. So my parole officer came into my house where I was living with my mother and handcuffed me while I was asleep and took me back to a correctional facility, a juvenile correctional facility. Meanwhile, my brother, I'm not aware of, is depressed because he thinks that I killed somebody. And he's so depressed that in school, they set him aside and they start asking him questions about what's wrong with him. And he states that I was arrested for murdering someone. And they started digging into that, and he started talking to them. And as a result, the detectives came to the correctional facility I was in, questioned me. I gave them a confession, and I was charged, sent to the juvenile facility before a judge. He determined that the case was so serious that it deserved to go before an adult court. So I was transferred to the adult court, superior court, and I was tried as an adult where I was sentenced to 45 years.
And they sentenced you for assault?
They sentenced me for attempted murder and arson first.
And arson. And that was a 45-year sentence at 15 years old.
Yes, 20 for the attempted murder, 25 for the arson to run consecutive.
So what, Carlos, do you think in your mind at 15 years old, when they tell you that you are looking at 45 years in prison, what's going through your mind?
There's no way to explain that because the processing was so disintegrated. There was no way of me connecting any points. I had no references at all. And so I was up in the air. But what I did know that was early on, I got an impression that what they were doing was wrong. And I got it by one of the very jurors who was supposed to be a peer of mine and is supposed to actually be judging me according to the law. And this young woman stood up, and when the prosecutor was telling her the kind of time that I could face if I lost trial, that woman told them, you know what? Do you expect me to sit here and actually judge a 15-year-old that you're considering sentencing 45 years? She said, absolutely not. I cannot be impartial to that. There's no way. And so suddenly I'm sitting here, I'm thinking, I did something heinous. I committed a horrible crime. And I deserve the entire law to come on my head because this is the impression that I was being given. And all of a sudden, here comes this lady and completely gives me the impression that, wait a minute, something is wrong here. Something is wrong here that people are not telling me. And then throughout my incarceration, I start doing the research, and I find that in 1944, a 14-year-old was electrified, executed. In 1944, a 14-year-old. Then in 1988, a 15-year-old was sentenced to death, and the Supreme Court overturned that case, stating that facing the court is the virtue of consistency. The virtue of consistency, they stated, they said it would be crazy, and I'm putting it in my own terms. They said it would be crazy to sentence someone who society has already determined cannot exhaust all of the rights that are given to regular adults. And so I started in this research, and I'm like, hold a minute, there's a problem here. I was sentenced with the idea that justice is being carried out and that I should be held accountable. And what I found throughout my incarceration is that the very people that are trying to hold me accountable are violating and contradicting all kinds of laws that they're claiming are in the best interest of justice to hold me accountable. And I found out very problematic from the beginning.
Wow. So I'm kind of curious how this all happened for you as far as even transport. You go from this world getting sentenced as a 15-year-old. Do you go directly to what kind of prison?
So I was sent to a facility that houses 14. They could house as young as 12-year-olds,
Okay.
all the way to 22-year-olds.
Okay.
And then as soon as I turned 18, they transferred me over to a prison that housed people from 18 years old all the way to 60, 70, men serving life sentences, had already been incarcerated for 20, 30, 40 years. But
So when you
yeah,
went, Carlos, when you went in there to that world, did you know people in that world? Because you had been out on the streets. I mean, you had been in an environment where people were going in and out of prison. What were there people there at your age that you were familiar with when you walked into that?
no, yeah, absolutely. Immediately the connections were made from, friends of mine that I saw in the streets that I knew were being locked up for
Mm-hmm.
drugs, for serious violent offenses. And, I was right back in the world that I was in.
Yeah.
But it didn't help at all, Brent, that my first impression of coming into the Department of Corrections was from a correctional officer that for me stood as a symbol of responsibility, of respect, of integrity. And I'm thinking to myself, like, this is the big leagues here. I'm about to be corrected.
Mm-hmm.
I'm about to be set straight.
Mm-hmm.
And immediately I met with an officer that tells me, oh, you like to beat women? They're going to have fun with you here.
Mm-hmm.
And so in my mind, the click is, okay, we're going to see that.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's not so much if I got to set myself straight. Now it's, I'm going to show you who's really a badass in this situation. And so immediately, whatever idea I had of these officers standing as symbols for responsibility were completely done away with, because here's a man that's being paid to not only oppose and completely eliminate the kind of violence that he's talking about, he's promoting it and getting off on it and telling me that it's going to happen to me. And so I was met with female officers who were being fired for engaging in sexual conduct with inmates, male officers who were getting fired for contraband. I mean, I was called the homosexual by female officers for not engaging in sexual conduct with them. I was called the snitch by correctional officers, male officers, for reporting on their unprofessional practices. And I was called the traitor by inmates for trying to live a responsible life. So I didn't know what to do with all of that.
Well, and I remember reading, and I can't remember if this was when you went into this world or if it was after you transferred, but you had a really rough entry into solitary confinement. Was that, am I talking and thinking the same, was this the same time period where you immediately went into solitary confinement, had no connection with anybody, family, anywhere?
Immediately. So their idea of protecting me was to put me in solitary confinement for 7 days and told me that because my bond was $500,000 and I had a violent crime, then I would have to be placed on high security. So from solitary confinement, they moved me to a high security unit surrounded by security risk groups, which are gang members who are older than me and thrive on violence. And the expectation was that somehow I behaved myself. So I ended up fighting about 3 of those gang members, then got sent to a place called chronic discipline, where you're there for 6 months in phase 1, and you have to remain compliant. This requires me to actually be handcuffed every time I'm outside my cell, take a shower while I'm handcuffed, and, be locked in the cell 23 hours a day without any electronics, without any commissary at all. And I remember that you're supposed to have these.
And Carlos, I've never even heard of, because I've heard a lot of different guys go into the hole and then they get to take a shower like 3 times a week or whatever. And I've never heard of people being handcuffed while they're taking their shower. I mean, that is a whole nother form of punishment and restraint. And you're 23 in, 1 out, right? And that solitary confinement, 23 hours of 1.
Yes, that's it. That's absolutely.
And you're 15.
And I'm 15. And this is supposed to be a juvenile facility.
Yeah.
So I want that to be clear. This is supposed to be a juvenile facility, and this is how they're treating us. And, to get the impression somehow that I'm supposed to reform myself and that I'm the problem, given those conditions, it's hard for me to focus on my character without looking at what they're doing to me at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so I remember that in one particular instance, I couldn't be moved to phase 2 because I was uncompliant, and I was uncompliant because I didn't smile enough.
Didn't smile
And they
enough?
didn't smile enough. I
Okay.
didn't have a positive attitude because I didn't smile enough. And so when I asked them about this and I challenged it, they told me this is not a joke. In order for you to move to phase 2, you have to improve on your attitude, and you don't smile enough. And so early on, like I knew this place was the problem, and not so much, my being a criminal.
So as you move along, and you're dealing with years here, so I have a hard time putting that into my world head, because I was sentenced to 5 years, and I can't imagine doing any more time than that of what my sentence was. But you were years into your prison experience, and you ran across a couple of guys that, I guess the biggest way that I can explain it is they really changed your world into the fact that you were doing really hard time. You weren't, it was tough. And these guys came along, and you were like, well, why you guys? So, what's there to be happy about? And by talking to them and getting to know them, you started to learn that there's choices regardless of some of these guys were doing life that you were talking to. But can you explain a little bit of how this happened? Because one of the things that I always talk about is, humbling yourself, looking around, seeing people who are getting it right. And in effect, you kind of did this, Carlos. You were asking, how are you doing this? Why are you happy? Why do you feel this way? And these guys really took you under their wing.
No, they did. And, you speak about nightmare success. This is where we're going to get into, the real nightmare of my success, because I started setting goals for myself. I started asking myself questions that I wouldn't allow myself anymore. And I would bypass my emotions by making myself think critically and tell myself that it didn't matter what I felt. The important thing was to focus on doing what's right. So that completely set me in a position for success like never before. And I started getting a job. I started saving up money. I came for my own associate's degree. And I started looking for people who reflected the kind of person that I wanted to be and the kind of world I lived in. And I came across these two men. By that time, I had accomplished many programs, rehabilitative programs in the Department of Corrections. So I thought to myself, I'm a success story. I'm doing great. I haven't caught a disciplinary ticket in so long. I haven't had a fight. I'm not getting in trouble. I'm doing great. And when I met these men, they were doing great. They were cellmates for 11 years together. They were reading books. They were challenging themselves. They were instituting programs in the Department of Corrections. They were writing books. They were challenging policy and practices. And I'm completely wowed by these men. And so I gravitated to them. And one of the first things that they told me was, Carlos, you're a criminal. You still have criminal tendencies. And they started giving me books that enlightened me and let me know, wow, this is correct. What I didn't expect, were to throw at me. And it was, listen, if you want to be successful, you have to stop buying into the ideas that the Department of Correction is teaching you through their program. They are not reflective of the real life consequences that are going to await you if you don't prepare yourself properly for society. And so they actually showed me how the program and the philosophy in those programs are just setting me up for failure, because they're only focusing on the very, very minimum of what's required of a person to be successful, which is criminal thinking. That's it. So, for example, if I had a drug problem, all that was required for me was to address my drug problem, and I'd be great. If I was a bad dad, all I had to do was become a great parent. If I had an anger issue, all that required for me was to deal with my anger issues, and I'd be great. The problem with that is that information is not connected, is not integrated at all. And so depending on what program you go to, they tell you that this is your problem, but they don't actually connect it to anything else.
That's interesting.
And so what I started to do was, through them, I started to actually get into the core of what my problem was. And it was that I thrived on violence. I thrived on criminal thinking. I thrived on giving people the impression that I was a changed person when I wasn't. And so if you don't connect all of these things in a way that keeps it focused on who you are and what you love to do and what your values are, you'll constantly point the finger and say, oh, it's because of the drug. Oh, it's because I was a bad father. Oh, it's because I didn't have a job, and so on and so forth. No, the problem is me. How do I get at the core of challenging the very values that I thrive? That required a completely different philosophy that focused on responsibility rather than victimhood, accountability and challenge rather than catering, distributing sympathy, and actually like lowering the bar in every single thing that required me to challenge myself. And that blew my door open completely.
Carlos, I want to stop right there because I want to get into how I think you connected those dots, because I think that is the secret sauce to how you get to the next step, and because you did connect all those dots. So let's take a quick break. I want to welcome our sponsor, AaronDuncan.net. It's a full-service global communications agency. They believe communication is everything. At AaronDuncan.net, their job is to make bad news go away. They're known as the trauma surgeons of brand crises, corporate scandals, high-profile litigation, negative customer feedback, prosecutions. These unwanted events are their daily challenge. To be in the public eye in the 21st century is to experience a crisis. It's no longer a question of whether a crisis will strike. It's a question of whether you will be prepared when it does. Some of the things they do with their services, it's crisis preparedness, crisis management, crisis communication, media relations, business continuity, positive public relations, training, speaking engagements, prison consulting and coaching. For a confidential consultation regarding crisis or reputation management, an advisory role, media interview, or speaking engagement, please contact Aaron at aaronwduncan@gmail.com. His phone number, you can text or phone, is 636-236-5071. I could have used Aaron Duncan back in my day for crisis management. So, Carlos, let's go back here because I want to put the pieces together, because what you were doing was what you thought you should be doing. You went through all the programming. You were getting all the certificates that they give you. You know, I went through RDAP, that was a federal program, and that gives you a year off. And there was all behavioral, rational thinking and, you know, your criminal mindset and all the different things that they roll into that. And that's not a bad program. It depends on who's teaching that program. So when you started figuring out with your mentors that what had really happened in your life, you know, that you had all this balled up inside of you, but there was a person down in that soul that wanted to break out, and you didn't want to be the criminal thinking guy. You wanted to be Carlos. How did you start breaking that away? What tools did you use?
So first, I had to be willing to face like myself in the mirror and say, okay, I created a heinous crime. I attempted to take the life of an innocent person. What does that say about me? And I don't mean what the Democrats are saying or what the Republicans are saying or what society is saying as a whole. What does it actually mean to be a criminal? And so I came across a book that was given to me by my mentors, and it's called Inside the Criminal Mind by Dr. Stanley Saminow. And in it, he detailed all of the criminal thinking errors that I needed to challenge in order to start making change. Now, the essential thing about it is that he emphasizes exposure. And so you have to constantly expose these things to somebody else so that you don't fool yourself into believing that you're making changes while you're not. So one of the thinking errors was power orientation. Mm. And I always had this sense that I needed to get power of everything that I was doing. And so if you ask me, why did you go into the house? Why did you want the gun? I would tell you that I needed it for protection in the streets because I didn't know who had a gun and they were going to shoot me. But that's bullcrap. What I wanted was to feel a sense of power because I know that having a gun provides me with that.
Right.
And so that's the kind of thinking that you have to go through in order to get at the root of the issue. The second thing was victim stance. This is a criminal thinking era that completely surrounded my life. And so I was never the problem. It was always ever. But even in the early age, we can talk about childhood development. We can talk about how the brain is not, fully developed compared to an adult, and that children are very impressionable. But I recall many children around my age seeing what I was doing and telling me, "You're out of your mind. I want absolutely nothing to do with you or what you're doing. I'm going to go to school and I'm going to think about my future." And so early on, I had these examples and these impressions that let me know that I was doing wrong, even though I wanted to convince myself that it wasn't wrong. And these are the kind of things that I had to go through in my mind when I was thinking about such a criminal thinking error as victims. The other one is cognitive indolence. And this is a criminal thinking error that many inmates have in the Department of Corrections when they're presented with information that's challenging. What cognitive indolence does is it says to the information, "Oh, that information is stupid," rather than actually saying, "No, you don't understand it, and you don't want to put in the necessary effort that's required to understand it because you're just lazy mentally." So get up off your ass, do what's necessary, and try to understand because information is everywhere. It's your responsibility to interpret it correctly and use it to make the proper decisions to guide your life. And so these are just three examples that require me to push beyond the programming that was going on in the institution and say to myself, wait a minute, like this is very simple stuff that's being taught in the Department of Corrections. And because I've never achieved anything in my life, since the bar is set so low, whatever I achieve is going to seem like a great accomplishment to me because it's being provided by the very people who are telling me that I have to meet those standards in order to be fit to return back into society. The problem is that now that sends false signals to everybody up the ladder. And so if I'm dependent on the Department of Corrections that's already failing, and the parole board is dependent on the Department of Corrections to present the accurate depiction of who I am as a person, when I go before the parole board and I have all these certificates, the parole board is saying, "Oh, great, look at what he's done, let him go." But the certificates don't reflect who I am as a person. And so if I don't take the programming and I oppose them and I'm being successful, in their eyes, I haven't done it. If I don't do it, if I do it and I'm not successful to them, they think I've done great. And so they release me. And when I get out into society,
you haven't changed.
The game is on. Yeah. And so all the pressure and the challenges start coming in because I don't have the necessary qualities or the skills in me to face those challenges. I'm back where I am. I think society is the problem. And the Department of Correction is back to doing its scientific work on me again. And I'm back where I started. And I have no idea what's going on.
And that's why.
So it's just a complete.
And that's why there's 2/3 that go back in 3 years and 3/4 that go back in 5, because that cycle doesn't solve the rehabilitation is our system is punishment. Rehabilitation of what you're thinking, Carlos, is what you did. You went through and said, why am I this way? What can I do to change it? And the responsibility is mine. It's not somebody else's. And carrying these certificates around doesn't mean it changed me. So I think what you're saying is so deep because it's so true that you have to first look at yourself and say, what am I doing? Why am I doing it? And how can I change that to be the person I want to be? And you went through those steps. I mean, that's not easy to do, first of all, for somebody to say, listen, I am who I am. Why am I this way? Can I change it? If I can, am I strong enough to grit through to make the change?
No, yes, absolutely. And there's a big difference between saying, I'm a drug addict, I'm a bad father, and I have anger issues, rather than saying, I like being a bad father, I love using drugs, and I love being high on drugs. And, there's this big different perspective of how you look at that, because the emphasis is placed on responsibility rather than on circumstances outside yourself. And so I think it's important to mention also, Brent, that when I started investigating the root of my problem and how the Department of Corrections wasn't addressing that problem, I understood my change in three different phases. And so the first phase consisted of this idea, this very premature idea of change that has to do with as long as I stay out of trouble, I'll be great.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter. And this is what the Department of Correction preaches. Stay out of trouble. That's it. Don't bother us. Don't break the rules. Just stay out of trouble.
Right.
The problem with that is that I found it's a passive state. And while I'm being passive and staying out of trouble, that's not going to create the kind of character that I need in order to be successful. All it's telling me is that there are problems out there in the world and I have to stay away from them because I am not the problem. So it reinforces the very thing that they're supposed to be eliminated. Mm-hmm. And then I moved on to the second phase. The second phase holds on to the idea that all I have to do is stay out of trouble, but now I'm engaging in productive and positive things in order that I don't go back to that trouble. So now the incentive is twisted. Now what's propelling me forward is the very thing that I should be eliminating. The problem with that is it creates a false alternative because in my mind now I'm telling myself there's only two options in life. Either I'm successful or I go back to a life of crime. But normal citizens don't live that way. You don't wake up every day and say, I'm going to do my podcast because I'm afraid that I might violate somebody else's right.
Right.
Or I'm going to invest in my children because I don't want to go back to prison.
Right.
So it's unrealistic. And at worst, what it did to me is that it placed much more emphasis on what's not being done rather than what is. And so getting a job is not as important as not committing a crime. Developing healthy relationships is not as important as not trying to violate somebody else's rights or getting high or committing crimes. And it just twisted completely this idea. And so I said to myself, I'm going to get rid of that. And I'm going to change my motivation because they're doing all of this as the carrot or the stick. Look, Carlos, you either behave or you follow the rules or you can't get freedom. So I said, okay, I'm going to do something that you guys don't expect. I'm going to get rid of the idea of chasing freedom. I'm going to focus on actually making freedom significant by developing myself into the kind of person that can appreciate freedom once I'm placed in the position to fully take advantage of it. So you can keep this whole idea and notion that you have about what freedom means. I'm going to focus on developing myself. And what happened, interestingly enough, after that, is when I started focusing on building myself, all these opportunities started to present themselves to me because I'm no longer confining myself to what the Department of Correction deems fit for success. And so I started reaching beyond the wall. I started writing people. I started reaching out to them. I began my citizenship in prison. And the nightmare success is here, Brent, is that the very department that was supposed to promote me in that began to oppose me. Mm. And I had to fight them in every single instance to make the kind of connections that were necessary for me to be successful. And I moved on to the third phase, which consisted of intellectual and moral development. And so I was able to put myself in a position where before I was saying, I shouldn't do this because I don't want to go back to prison, into I'm not going to do this because I know that it's wrong. Exactly. It doesn't matter who sees it, who hears it, right, who knows it. I know it. And I don't think so little of myself to convince my mind to opt into this premise that, Carlos, you're such an insignificant person that you can do anything because only you will know. Mm-hmm. Only me is everything. And I learned to value myself so much that I can't deal with that kind of idea in my mind that is telling me that it doesn't matter what I do because I'm the only person in the end who has to do it. And this is what I pushed against the Department of Corrections and everything they taught me. And it just boggled my mind completely. And my mentors were instrumental in pushing me beyond the Department of Corrections because if not, I'm telling you right now, I'll be out here thinking, I'm just going to the university because I don't want to go back to a life of crime. That's bullshit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. That's some good stuff, Carlos. I want to ask you because I know that you, at a very young age, had a son. Is that, with all this that went on in your world, what is that relationship like?
It's awesome. It's awesome, Brent. I mean, his mother made an excellent point of making sure that we had a relationship early on, even though I was very, very chaotic, and it wasn't a good idea to, bring him around me. She made it a point to say, you're going to have a relationship with him and he's going to come see you. And, it was just amazing to me to see her go from, you have to see your father in prison because it's your father, to saying, hearing my son tell his mother, I need to see my father because I need some advice. And he helps me.
That's great.
And then seeing her saying, I need to see him as well. He provides us with a sense of positivity and energy and inspiration that we can take back and, use on our hardest of days. So seeing that transformation alone, and even when I was having difficult times and I would sit with my son and her, and we were able to actually build on the things that we had already constructed, and seeing the impact that my change was having in their lives, just made me reflect in so many ways and stick to what I was doing, and also look at my mentors in a very different way, that they can impact my life in a way that I can contribute in such a way to the life of others. I mean, it just continued to keep me grounded.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. How old is he now?
He's 25.
25. Wow.
I had him when I was 14. Yeah, 25.
Wow.
I love him, and we're great together.
Well, I could tell by reading the background story that you as a unit, you're between the mom, you, him, you guys, and that's not easy. I mean, so many, this, Carlos, hardly anybody makes it through with their family, and to be able to keep that connection, that's not going to be a regret. That's going to be something you're going to be so happy that you have from here on out. As you got close to the door to your freedom, what did you start thinking? What was going on in your mind?
It's interesting because HBO was there when they granted me parole. And, they asked me, what do you think about the decision? And my response to that was, this system is so twisted that I wonder how much of you guys being here influenced that decision. Mm. And so I wasn't even thinking about, wow, it's great, I'm home, I'm free. For two reasons. One, I committed a heinous crime. I destroyed the life of an innocent person. Two, I left a son to grow up without a father. Mm-hmm. And three, I lost 24 years of my life. Mm. So I had nothing to celebrate at all. No matter how you look at it, it's a tragedy. I just knew that I had some serious making up to do. Mm-hmm. But that first part that I mentioned was difficult for me because I wasn't thinking about freedom in any which way. And I couldn't help but think to myself, like, how much of this freedom has to do with the fact that it's being documented?
Yeah.
And that was my focus. It was, what would have happened had I not been here? You can't trust that system. You can't trust it at all. I mean, I know a man who was incarcerated at the age of 14. I knew that this man did enough to be released back into society. He went before a parole board, and like I told you about these false signals, he had no drug problem. The parole board recommended he take a tier 2 program and come back in 2 years after he spent 25 years in prison already because he had a drug problem and that led to his crime, and he would be released. Now, I know that drug problem is a joke. And so they just sent him back to take a program that if he did have a drug problem wouldn't have helped him, and he would have been released 2 years later and probably committed another crime because the program wasn't good. But if the program was deemed to be good or whatever, he didn't have a drug problem anyway.
Right.
So it was just that. So, I didn't go in there at all thinking that these people knew more about me than I knew about them. I just wanted to show them through everything that I could that what they provided me with was not enough, and that I went beyond the expectations of them in order to parole hearing. 2 years prior to it, I wrote every single board member and told you your programs don't work and this process is flawed because you're depending on signals that don't reflect the reality of what's going on in the program and the Department of Corrections. And it's in your best interest to correct it because you're going to be assessing my care for one day. And so I wasn't thinking about freedom. All I was and I have work to do, and these are the reasons why.
So, Carlos, what is your looking at? You've been out for 3 months, 24 years. It's got to be a huge mind buzz to you. And I know that you set yourself up and you became ready. What do you see for yourself going forward? You had 24 years of your life inside. Now you've got the rest of your life on the outside. How do you see that?
I don't know what the future is going to bring, Brent, but I'll tell you what, I define myself as successful, and I'll tell you why. It has nothing to do with my achievements. It has nothing to do with my accomplishments. I've never walked into a space after I dedicated myself to change where I convinced myself that only in certain spaces am I required to be fully aware, am I required to be fully present, am I required to be the best that I can be. That's my approach in general. Mm-hmm. And so the way I see my life is that no matter where I end up, as long as I hold on to the idea that whether failure or challenge or what may present itself, that I'm capable of coping with the basic challenges of life, and that no matter what happens, I can deal with it and always carry that sense that's with me, because it's not particular to any specific area. It's particular to who I am as a person, what I love about myself, and what I'm continually to build within that character to feel that I'm the most and just optimistic person that I can be. And I just project that onto the world in general.
Well, and I think, Carlos, you've proven to yourself that you can adapt to anything, that you can, whether you're a 15-year-old kid or 24 years later, you have adapted to the environment that you were in and improved yourself in that environment and came out a better version of yourself. I'm curious, because I always ask people this, I'm curious what your answer is that after you've gone through all that you've gone through, and this is quite an unbelievable story of yours, of how you've lived to this point, what do you think is your biggest takeaway to the listeners out there of what you've lived through?
Wow. I think that everything comes down to not paying an automatic deference to institutions, to adults, or to any people in power. Because it's very easy to believe once something is set in stone that they have the right recipe and that they're correct. And what I found is that everybody is negatively affected by this idea that because other people are wrong, it justifies our behavior. And because we have a power over them, and because we are the ones in charge of instructing them, that no oversight and no supervision should be directed at us at all. And so my message to everybody was, especially when looking at children, is that you do not take for granted the things that your institution is telling you they're carrying out. Because most often than not, in my own experience, the opposite is true. And so my success, ironically, came from the day when I decided that I was going to challenge the Department of Corrections and all its policies and practices. And here I am today.
That is really something, isn't it? That is really something, Carlos. I am so happy that I got to sit down with you today. One of the great things about my job here as a podcast host is I love these stories. I love having a platform where these type of stories can be heard, because nothing was easy. You stepped through it, and I'm going to be so interested, and I want to stay in touch with you because I think you've got great things ahead of you. You've got things that are the way that you have your mind and everything's set for you now. I just can't imagine anything but good coming from what you're going to be doing. So thank you, Carlos. I appreciate it. For all those out there, Carlos talking about reading books and whatever, I've got a book, Nightmare Success, Loyalty, Betrayal, Life Behind Bars, Adapting, Finally Breaking Free. Go get it. It's on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, or you can get it at Walmart. Hey, I love you guys leaving reviews. It really helps the show. I don't know what happens with the algorithm, but when I get more reviews, it pumps up the volume of the show. So go there. It's easy on Apple. You go, there's a little 3 lines there. It drops down. You go to my page. Actually, the 3 lines actually allow you to follow the show. Go to my page and you go down, you see the review. It's got 5.0 and then it says write a review. Go click that. It's real easy. Don't even have to say much. Just say you like the show. It'll pump up the volume. I want to also say a shout out to Adovo. I'm really loving being on their platform. It's in over 200 prisons, hundreds of thousands of tablets. This goes in there today, Carlos. Your story that will inspire people that are behind the walls, that things can happen good on the outside. And BrentCassidy.com, leave me a message. I love going back and forth with people on my website. As I used to say when I was writing my emails back and forth in prison, stay strong. I'll do the same. Carlos, thanks so much today. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Brent.
Nightmare Success, in and out.